So I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Houston, Texas. Since I was born in the United States. My parents had immigrated from Korea, and my family was very apolitical. So if you had asked me as a kid if I would become a political scientist, like there would have been nothing further from my mind as something that I would do. But I got involved in student activism when I went to college. I did my undergraduate work at Harvard, and by happenstance, got involved in a student organization that happened to get into a fight with the university. And so, we decided we're gonna plan a big rally at Harvard Yard and, try to fight the man. And someone told me oh, well, if you're gonna do this, maybe you should take a class on community organizing. And I had never heard of it, but I ended up in this class because someone told me I could get course credit for doing the work that I was gonna do. And so I thought that was sounded really great. And when I took the class, it sort of opened my eyes to a world of organizing and politics and social movements that I just never really been exposed to. Because my parents were immigrants, a lot of the, things that we talked about around the dinner table we didn't talk about current events, we didn't talk about the news. We talked about things I remember having a long conversation once about how do you eat bread? My parents, we grew up in a culture that was very oriented around rice, and bread was very complicated. When you slice it, when you rip it, how do you know which side you butter? All these things were sort of really hard to know how to navigate. And those are the kind of things that we talked about. When I took this class on organizing, I think what it did was it opened my eyes to a world of people that had an analysis that helped make sense of a lot of experiences that I had growing up that I had just never really understood were even there. And it was that analysis and that ability to kind of locate my own personal experience in this broader framework, I think that really spoke to me. And I think that the things that were particularly relevant were, one, this idea that at the heart of social movements or any kind of large grassroots effort for social change is, in my mind, this notion of transformation, right? The idea that part of what we can do by working with each other is transform ourselves so that we can transform our communities. And I think that was really what was at the heart of my experience growing up as a child of immigrants. I don't know that my parents ever said that word to me or said anything like that at the dinner table, but it was just in the background of our lives that through the choices they made, part of their quest as parents, as humans, was to transform themselves and so that it could transform the experience for our family. And so when I kind of began to see that in a broader social landscape, that was really important. The second thing I think that was really relevant was the other part of my childhood that was important was my grandparents on my dad's side were originally refugees from North Korea, South Korea. So my dad was originally born in North Korea, and then as a baby, he doesn't remember it, but had migrated south with his parents during the Korean War. And so my grandparents were part of the generation that rebuilt South Korea after the war. But my grandfather had, the history of the Korean War, the border was moving back and forth for a long time. And there was a moment at which, people weren't sure exactly when the border was going to shut, and then it just shut down. And so what happened was that my grandfather lost contact with his mother and one of his sisters. And so he never saw her again. He has now died, presumably she's also died, and so he lost contact with his family. And I think, that story was a story that was always passed down to us as children, and it was part of the experience that, informed, I think, a lot of the choices that my parents made. But I think that what it taught me were two things. One is my grandfather had a really clear sense of what it meant or what it felt like to be a pawn in a game that someone else was controlling, and that that feeling of having no agency, kind of, tore apart, things that were the most precious to him, like his, relationship with his mother and things like that. And second, that the things that we have are really fragile, that we have to sort of protect them and that we have a responsibility to protect them. And so even if my parents didn't necessarily raise us in a landscape that had this kind of notion of politics kind of built into it, I think we had this sense that, we have to work to protect the things that we care about, and that we, none of us want to feel the way that my grandfather felt, when he had that experience. And so anyways, this is all just a long way of saying that when I landed by happenstance in this class on social movements and organizing in college, it sort of opened my eyes to a broad I think, way of approaching the world that had resonance with things in my background that I didn't know it had resonance with until I was exposed to it. And so that's what got me interested in politics. I had majored in history and literature as an undergrad because I loved reading books, and so I hadn't taken any classes in political science, but decided after college I wanted to go and work in politics, and so I got a job working in DC and did, you know, capital P kind of institutional politics, worked on political campaigns, worked on the Hill, like did a lot of things like that. And eventually when I worked on a political campaign that was, I worked on a campaign that lost, and so I lost my job because the campaign ended. And so I thought that's a great time to go to grad school. So I went to grad school, and I sort of went to grad school intending to, I sort of wanted a break, and I thought, oh, this will be great. Someone's going to pay me to go to school, and I can just like read for a few years, then I'll go back and I'll work in politics. And I ended up liking the research and the teaching more than I thought I would. And so that's how I got pulled into academia. But I think I'd always, I entered into academia, as you just were mentioning this briefly this morning, with this sense that I always wanted to do work that felt relevant to the world. You know, I didn't go into academia coming out of a scholarly discipline so much as I came out of this experience in the political world, and I wanted to use research as a way of making sense of that. And so I've had the real privilege, I feel like, for many years throughout my career to kind of do this work in the P3 lab, you know, where we are trying to understand how you make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful, in partnership with different grassroots entities around the world. And so a lot of what we do is we partner with different social movement organizations or grassroots organizations or constituency-based organizations, and then we essentially put data and learning around their work to try to help understand what are the strategies they can use to most effectively pull people off the sidelines into public life. But then second, you know, just because you get people involved doesn't mean it actually matters. Like, what is a scaffolding that you need to build around people to kind of translate people's engagement into the kind of political influence that they want? And at the core of that work, in my mind, is really this question of what does it take to enable people to feel like they can be architects of their own future, you know? And as I reflect on this kind of political moment that we're in, and look at trends and sort of some of the kind of fragile nature of democracy around the world, I think there's obviously a lot of complexity and a lot of causes and consequences of that. But I think one trend that I see that sometimes I worry doesn't get enough attention is the kind of disaffection people feel when, you know, as we see inequality growing, both economic and political and social inequality growing around the world, that and people feel more and more precarious, that fewer and fewer people feel like they can be authors of their own future, you know? And so when people begin to sense that growing gap between people, those who feel like they're objects of the political system versus those that are subjects of it, that I think people react in different ways, and sometimes that reaction can be one of anger, you know, and one of divisiveness. And so I think those are the kind of trends that we're seeing. And so that's how I sort of locate some of my own sort of work in this broader kind of question about what it takes to make democracy work. And so maybe I'll just say a little bit about one of the hats that I wear at Hopkins on this question of democracy, and then talk a little bit more about the book. So the institute that I lead at that I've had the privilege of leading at Johns Hopkins is called the SNF Agora Institute. You know, it was started in 2017 through a big gift from a very generous donor to the university. But I always like to say that I think there are two big hypotheses in a way that underlie the creation of the institute. We're called the Agora Institute first and foremost because I think the first hypothesis is the sense that you know, in making democracy work, the notion of the proverbial agora actually really matters, you know? And so the agora, for those of you who remember your ancient history, you know, is the marketplace in Athens where people would come together to shop. But you know, Socrates would be teaching, people would run into neighbors. You know, it was a kind of civic marketplace where people would develop the habits and capacities and motivations that are needed to want to work and be in community with other people. And part of the hypothesis I think that underlies our institute is a sense that that matters, but B, that's become really hollowed out or emaciated, both in the United States, but in all over the world. And that if we want to confront the challenges that we see to democracy in the 21st century, that part of what we have to do is understand the causes and consequences of that decline. So that's part of what we do. The second, I think, hypothesis that underlie the creation of the Institute is the notion that universities matter, that higher education really matters, and that, obviously there's so many people that are working on these kinds of questions from lots of different perspectives, from people who are doing work on the ground in communities around the world to policymakers and people that manage our political institutions and so on, but that, higher education has a role to play, both in doing the kind of inquiry that is possible in a university that's not possible in other places, but also in being a social institution that teaches, that forms community, that models the principles of the Agora. And so a lot of we at the Institute, we're a multidisciplinary institute. We talk about the idea that we organize our work around 3 functions. We call them discovery, design, and dialogue. So discovery is scholarly research. That part of what we can do is do the kind of deep inquiry that's possible at universities that's not possible elsewhere. Second is dialogue, which is what we think of as the work that we do to be in dialogue with different publics. So that includes everything from, we have a robust program of events and convenings. We host the University Debate Initiative. We try to bring a wide variety of different kind of public events together that enable different audiences to engage with us, but we also do a lot of teaching and training. So we think of that as part of our dialogue work too, both in terms of the teaching that we do with undergraduates and graduate students at Hopkins, but also with other entities. We have a big project, for example, with the National Health Service in the UK, and have been, doing some training with other entities like that. And then the third is we have a pillar of work that we call design. And I would say, I think that's probably our most experimental piece of work. Discovery and dialogue is kind of like, that's what universities do. We do research, we host events, we're conveners, and we teach. Design is what I think of as a translational space, where we think about how do you take insights from scholarly research and turn it into usable knowledge for civic and political actors, and then vice versa, how does the knowledge in the field feed back into and shape work in the university. And I think that's where we're doing the most experimentation. A lot of the models for translation that we have in the university come out of the hard sciences, where a biologist figures out something about the human body, and then that gets, there's a whole relationship to industry that translates that into like a product that can be taken to market. And I think one of the real challenges is that in the kind of problems that we're working on as social scientists, where there aren't formulaic solutions to the problems that we're trying to understand, there's never going to be a vaccine for disinformation, like if there was, or a pill for tolerance, how do we think about the strategic and relational challenges that are necessary to try to do that translational work? And so we have a variety of different things that we're trying there. But so that's kind of, I've been working with the Institute since 2019. Along the same time as that, I've been working on this book, which is, I think, very related to both of these themes. And so the book Undivided came out last fall, and it basically tells the story of 4 people within the 3rd largest evangelical megachurch in America that are organizing around racial justice. And so the church is called the Crossroads Church. It is based in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a church that draws 35,000 people per week, each week in person to its services. So it's got a scale that like rivals the NFL, okay? They have about 35,000 people that show up across 10 geographic campuses in Southern Ohio and Northern Kentucky, and about 500,000 people that tune into their services online. So even if they're spread across these 10 different geographic campuses, they project one service into that whole community. So it is a unified kind of church experience. And I myself did not grow up in an evangelical community. I did grow up in Texas, so I was around a lot of evangelicals, but I didn't grow up in a Protestant evangelical community. But I came upon this because I was actually in Cincinnati doing work on a 2016 ballot initiative that was a really unusual initiative that caught my eye as a political scientist. And what made it unusual was that in 2016, that was the year that Trump beat Clinton, you remember? Political time feels so long, it's hard to remember, right? It was a year that Trump beat Clinton. Trump won Ohio by about 8 percentage points that year. In that same year, there was a ballot initiative in Cincinnati that passed by the largest margin of any new education levy in Cincinnati history. And it was a new tax, property tax on Cincinnati residents that they voted in themselves, that essentially gave targeted resources to the poorest Black communities in Cincinnati to provide universal preschool for children in the city. And so it was kind of this unusual story where I thought, well, how is it that if that passed by the largest margin of any new education levy in Cincinnati history, then there had to be voters who both voted for Trump and supported this ballot initiative. And I wanted to understand how a kind of coalition to pass what was, by all measures, a very progressive bill was able to kind of come through. So I went to Cincinnati, and as I was talking to people in the campaign, they kept telling me like, oh, well, there's this church, they're sending all these volunteers, and that happens all the time when you study political campaigns, and you kind of nod politely, and usually it's like, I love the Unitarians, but it's like, usually it's a couple Unitarians who are making a few phone calls, like once, in the fall or something like that, right? And as I dug more deeply into this, what I realized was that, it wasn't just a couple people who made a few phone calls once, but it was hundreds of volunteers that came out week after week after week throughout the fall of 2016 to sort of help build a coalition. They knocked doors, they made phone calls, they did all the work that you need to do to make this campaign possible. And second, that they were coming from this Protestant evangelical megachurch. And I thought, well, that's unusual, right? Because that was the same election where, if you look at the exit polling data, it was like 8 in 10 Protestant white evangelicals voted for Trump, and this was a white dominant church. So that's what brought me into this story, because it was just such an unusual story. And as I dug into it, what I realized was that all of these people who had been involved in the campaign had gotten animated to do this work because they were part of a program called Undivided. And so, and that's the title of the book. Excuse me. Undivided was a racial justice program that was started by the highest ranking Black pastor in the church. His name is Chuck Mingo. And he had grown up in the Black church in Philadelphia. He had moved to Cincinnati because he had a job working in sales for Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble is based in Cincinnati. He thought he was going to work in business, but then he felt a calling to go into ministry, and he eventually became a pastor at this church. The church is 80% white, 20% non-white. So he was a Black pastor in a white dominant church and had not really spoken out much about race during his time on the pastoral staff. But then in 2015, there was a police shooting of an unarmed Black man in Cincinnati that brought the national debate about policing to Cincinnati, and it made it very visceral. And because Crossroads is such a big presence in the community, they couldn't avoid that issue. And Chuck, the pastor, he spoke up on stage one day, and he sort of said, I feel a calling to be a voice for racial healing in the city. And he knew that would be a controversial thing to say because race was not something they tackled a lot from the pulpit in the church. And but he felt like he had to say something, and so he thought he would say something. He would give a sermon about it, and then that would be it. But after he spoke, he had thousands of people from the congregation who reached out and said, "If you're going to do something, I want to be a part of it." And it was that. He also got a lot of pushback too, just to be clear, But it was that outpouring of support that made him think, "Oh, well, I have to do something now." And so essentially what he did was he eventually built this program called Undivided that starts off as a 6-week curriculum, essentially, as a weekly curriculum around racial justice. It takes congregants through that experience, organized into small groups, and then it invites them into ongoing action. And so one of the things that they invited people into was to get involved in this preschool campaign in the city. And they launched the program Undivided. The first cohort of it started in early 2016, and they had 1,200 people from the church who went through the program, all organized into small groups of 8 to 10 people. They were mixed race groups, and then and then they were invited all those people to then go on and get involved, and that's sort of how issue 44 came about. So what the book does is it essentially traces 4 characters who've gone through Undivided and kind of tells their story. The book is published by Knopf. This is the other thing I'd say. The book is published by Knopf, which is not an academic press. Like most of the writing that I've done in the past has been academic writing. It's on in an argument with other political scientists or something like that. This was written for a general audience, and so one of the great joys of writing this book for me was also learning how to write you know, in the style of narrative nonfiction. And so the book is grounded in the story of 4 characters, a Black man, a white man, a Black woman, and a white woman. The Black man is Chuck Mingo, who's the pastor. The other 3 characters are all congregants who went through the church. And it traces, the first half of the book is called Agitation. So it traces how each of them kind of got pulled into Undivided, what their experience of that 6-week program was like, how, you know, they all get animated into wanting to kind of do ongoing action. And then the second half of the book is called Backlash. Each of the characters in different ways, when they take on the work of living out values of racial justice in their lives, they face significant backlash from within their own families, from within their church communities, from their workplaces, you know, from everywhere. And so the question in the second half of the book really is, what does it take for them to sort of sustain their commitment to this work and navigate the backlash in you know, deeply personal in some cases in their lives. And so the book kind of traces, and I hope tells, I think, what is kind of a complex story of what it takes to kind of do this work. And so I think I'm at the end of the time, but I thought that I would just read like a short passage from the book to kind of give you a sense of a little bit from it, and then you know, and then would be happy to kind of take the discussion.
Can you read it slower?
Yes, sorry. I talk really, yeah, this is a real problem I have. I talk really fast.
It's wonderful for us, but I think the Zoom might be, it'd be better to have it a little slower.
Especially if you have a microphone.
Okay.
There's a really good mic in there. I saw that in the chat. Oh, you mean for you? I see. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
So, so the book came out in September, and I've had just the enormous privilege of going around the country and talking with a lot of audiences about the book. And, you know, it's, again, just reflecting a little bit on how different it is to write a trade book than it is versus an academic book. You know, I've never in my life, you know, done an academic book talk where I've read a passage of my book like aloud to the audience. You know, it's like, allow me to tell you my regression coefficient. But you know, but I have in this for this, which has been really fun. And usually what I do when I read passages that try to pick out a story about one of the characters to kind of give you a flavor of what the stories are like. This morning, as I was thinking, or last night when I was thinking about what I wanted to read here, I think I'm going to read a little bit more from the introduction that gives which is a place where I kind of reflect more broadly on some of my own lessons and my own relationship to the work.
A little slower, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. I was just saying that I was gonna read from the introduction because that was the opportunity I had to step back and reflect on the writing experience and the research experience itself. The reason why I thought I would read from that today as opposed to one of the stories of the characters is, you know, as we all know, our new president just got inaugurated on Monday. It feels like we're in a new political moment right now. And as I personally have been navigating this political moment, I think one of the questions I've been thinking about is how we as individuals and humans kind of navigate the deep divisions that are becoming so exposed and the seams that feel like they're dividing our communities in different ways. You know, in a place like Baltimore that is more politically homogenous, it's harder to see. In a place like Houston, where I grew up, it's very clear what some of these divisions are. And that was something that I think I learned a lot about as I worked on this book, you know, because I had to go into this Protestant evangelical white dominant Midwestern community, you know, coming from a very different place. And so I thought that I would just read a little bit about that, but I'm happy to talk about any other portion of the book. So, okay, so this is from the introduction. So it says, when I first got to know Crossroads, I was worried its leaders and congregants might be suspicious of me and unwilling to talk. I was a college professor, a member of the purported coastal elite that the media liked to pit against Midwestern evangelicals. I was neither white nor black, but Asian, occupying a liminal category of race in America. And I was a lapsed Catholic. I had attended 11 years of Catholic school in Texas as a child. We had school-wide mass every Wednesday and started every Friday with a prayer service in the school gym. I began to chafe against Catholicism in high school, however, when I couldn't reconcile things my classmates and teachers said in theology class with the things they did. Crossroads, which is the name of the church, Crossroads, however, welcomed people not in spite of their flaws, their differences, their ignorance, or their odious past, but because of them. True to their culture, the people I met approached me with warmth and welcomed me into their experiences with kindness and generosity. When I first got to know them at the start of the Trump era, it was a church that seemed to hold people with opposing viewpoints together, even in a polarized nation. Instead of the politically conservative, fundamentalist, Bible-thumping older white men who dominated public images of evangelicalism, Crossroads had a younger and more racially, ideologically, and socially diverse congregation. As I spent more time with the people who had gone through Undivided, I learned that neither the journeys of the individuals nor the program itself would be linear. I witnessed in real time the hard, unpredictable, unrelenting path that emerges for a group of people committed to individual and social transformation. Sometimes it was inspiring, sometimes it was just drudgery. Here were people committed to doing something about racial injustice when most other people felt stymied. Here were people who stood up for what they knew in their hearts they had to do, even though their friends, family, neighbors, and even clergy disagreed. The Crossroads congregants who participated in Undivided represented a group of people who did not have a social home in America. They were too conservative for many left-leaning groups and too liberal for many right-leaning groups. They agitated for their sense of justice, even as the home they found in their work kept changing. Sometimes Crossroads embraced them and their work, and other times it actively pushed them away. And then, so just say this. These stories do not reveal that Undivided has cracked a secret code or developed a perfect model that everyone else lacks. Undivided is one program in a vast landscape of both faith-based and secular programs dedicated to anti-racism. Critics argue that it's too corporate or too superficial, that it grew out of a white-dominant community, ignoring the long legacy of Black churches and Black faith leaders who had been doing the work for much longer, that it's too biblical, that it's not biblical enough, that given the demographics of Crossroads, it focuses too much on the Black-white divide, ignoring other communities of color. These debates are real and necessary. They push a field of leaders, programs, and organizations working on anti-racism to be better. But to most of the thousands of participants taking one night a week out of their busy lives to give Undivided a try, these debates felt remote. Undivided was not perfect, and the experiences participants had were hardly uniform. But it had the great advantage of being available to people who were craving something from their church. It gave them a chance to struggle in concrete ways with the question of what it meant to respect and fight for the dignity of all, to enact in concrete ways their belief that everyone is a child of God. All the participants in Undivided were taking a risk, and the work remains incomplete. Only by taking these risks did 4 people begin to pursue a different possible world emerging at the seams of the existing one. In a moment when the nation is struggling to realize a vision of the multiracial America, this story offers a glimmer of the enormity of what real change might demand. And then for Q&A, should I?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay.
That's great. And folks at home, just if you could put questions in the chat, we'll do our best to include some of those as well.
Okay.
Sam had his hand up first.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you for being here. Did the Cincinnati Jewish community get on board with the initiative to have pre-K for the African American?
Yes, there was a multi-faith coalition that was built over time, and that included, key rabbis and other synagogues that were in the community. There were, like Catholic churches, like other kind of Christian denominations that were involved, and a lot of just like community leaders that helped. So yeah, so it was a very kind of like multi-sector, multi-faith coalition over time that I think was able to build the broad majority that they needed.
So I just learned from the Inside Flap your book that you also wrote a book about organizing under Obama.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of us feel like cross purposes between our individual purposes and organizing tendencies and the imperfect organizations we're a part of.
Yes.
And I'm sure you don't have any simple truths, but and you're a social scientist, so you look at the decision making by individuals, right? So I wonder what enlightenment you've reached or can give to us, or at least what you're thinking about as to how to square that circle, because Obama's volunteers got co-opted, and I feel sometimes co-opted or at cross purposes, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great question. So here's what I'll say. So I believe really strongly in the fact that kind of organizations, and here I'm using the term loosely, it doesn't have to be like a formal 501c3 organization, but the kind of collective entities that scaffold and shape the work that people do in communities really matter. And I think that, but they're flawed, right? We're all human, and the institutions that we create are therefore human also. And so they have all the problems I think that you're intimating in your question. The way that I like to think about it is there's a great political scientist named Albert Hirschman who wrote this terrific book in the mid-20th century called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And he talks about the difference between political organizations and market organizations, right? And the point that he makes is that in market organizations, the whole logic of the organization is one of exit, right? So if I don't like the product that the company is creating, then I just go buy another product, right? I'm a consumer of that. And so if I don't like Chex, I go buy Cheerios, right? If I don't like Hunt's ketchup, I buy Heinz, whatever, right? But in a political organization, they can't succeed if people operate on the logic of exit. In order to make a political organization succeed, they have to operate on the logic of voice, right? And so what that means is that when I see these imperfections in the organizations that I inhabit, that I have to, kind of use my voice, right? Like exercise my voice as a way of trying to improve it. And that's one of the real challenges, I think, and actually, I think the join or die, like some of the themes that come out in Robert Putnam's work about the decline of social capital, like one of the real challenges is that too many of our social, civic, and political organizations have begun to operate on the logic of exit, right? Where they are trying to kind of essentially sell people products, right? So, civic products essentially that people want. If they don't like it, then they just got to go and choose a different organization. And that's really problematic because it doesn't create the kind of binding loyalties, which is the third part of the Hirschman framework, that are necessary to make these human institutions work. And so I think that, the kind of, one of the reasons why I got really interested in the work that I was doing in addition to what I talked about is there's a famous political scientist who kind of has this idea that, the promise of democracy is that it allows people to overcome inequality of resources with equality of voice. Right, and that's the foundational promise of the relationship between politics and markets in a democracy. And you can translate that into the kind of organizations that we have. That is the equality of voice, right, and the kind of countervailing struggle to sort of shape the institutions that govern our lives. That should enable us to kind of create the collective world that we want. But too often nowadays, the organizations that we inhabit don't give us that chance. And so I think that was true in how the 2008, 2012 Obama campaigns translated into OFA, after the elections. I think it's true for a lot of the civic institutions that we have. I will say, by the way, that I think an exception to that rule are faith institutions. That faith institutions are some of the few institutions we have still where people still have this like space to exercise voice. And so I'll just sort of like one thing about Undivided is I was doing research on this book. I was startled to learn about kind of mega churches in America. So I didn't know this, but the largest 9% of churches by size in America contain 50% of the church-going population, right? So church attendance is heavily skewed towards these large churches, and most churches in America, median church in America has fewer than 100 people and is dying, right? But the mega churches have grown by about 34% in the last decade, right? So the church attendance is very skewed and they're growing. And so anyways, this is like part of what I'm saying is like, I think there's a lot of people out there who are hungry for that experience of being part of an institution where they can have that kind of voice. There aren't a lot of places where they can do that. And so these churches that enable that, I think you see some of these patterns. So.
We just have a clarification question from home. To start, you talked about the voting patterns of the church. Could you repeat that? Who did people actually vote for within the church?
So no, I don't know exactly who people voted for because that they don't capture that data. But I can say anecdotally the church leans right for sure. Like I think that it probably leans right, but it leans right mostly because a lot of people in the church community who aren't involved explicitly in politics assume that if you're Christian in America, you have to be Republican. And that I think, this kind of gets into a larger thing, but I like one of my complaints with the way that politics sometimes plays out in America is that we blame people for things, which I think of as more like a demand side problem, where I think we should think about what the supply side is that we're offering. And so what I mean by that is that a lot of times people say like, oh, what's wrong with people? Why don't they why can't they talk to people they disagree with? Why don't they do this? Why do Christians all believe that they have to be Republican? And the the supply side question that I would ask in return is, how often are we inviting people into opportunities to engage with people who are different from them, right? How often are we inviting people into places where they can learn the skills and habits of tolerance? How often are Democrats inviting Christians into spaces where they feel welcome, you know? And so I think there's often a kind of supply side problem that underlies some of these patterns. So I don't know exactly what the political distribution is. My guess is that it would be, it's definitely majority conservative. A lot of the people in the Crossroads community are generally disaffected from politics. They feel like they are left out of the broader political system. There's definitely a kind of MAGA Trump contingent within a church that large in the Midwest. I think it's pretty hard to avoid that. But there's also a contingent of, you know, what some people call disaffected evangelicals, you know, people who adhere to the faith tenets of evangelicalism, but don't adhere to the political identity of it.
Something that you hit on and saying concrete was interesting and makes me think of like frameworks. Really, that in an era where there's like the University of Google or this illusion of self-education, that people are really craving a curriculum and something to go through. And I wonder, especially with things in some cases now forced coming back offline or people returning to work, a lot of theory that I'd heard at this market and civics intersection about what happens to that time that's freed up if you're not commuting to DC every day. Oh, that will go to community engagement.
Right.
So do you, and this is a bit more of a political science, like quantifiable thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's been a shift in kind of the maximum sustainable engagement that an American citizen can have, because if they are learning in these kinds of curricula, then they can apply that not only for church, but for the baseball league or whatever it is?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of things in the question. So a couple things. So first, I do think it is true that the skills are transferable in the ways that you're just saying at the very end. So that like there's a lot of research that shows like if I learn small d democratic habits of engaging with people who are different from me, of getting involved in my community, of thinking about the common good in my faith institution, then that translates into the baseball league. There is that like that transfer. This is the whole kind of like Bob Putnam-esque sort of idea that like join or die, right? Because if you join, then you learn these skills of social capital that transfer into other domains. So that is absolutely true. I haven't, you know, it is also true that there is a pattern that people who have more free time are more likely to get involved. And so as people's time, you know, for commuting reduces, then we might expect that there is more opportunity for people to get involved. But and I haven't actually seen I haven't seen any clear data on that since in the post-pandemic era, so I don't know exactly how that's unfolded. But it is also true that we see a lot of examples of things that what I would say are on the off diagonal, right? So people who don't have a lot of free time yet are highly involved, right? And so what that tells me, I think, is that you know, time is an expression of value, right? And if I step back, you know, and think about my own life, it's like I put time into things that I care about. So there are many times when I come home and I feel like, oh, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I have all this work, I have all these emails I need to respond to, and then my kid needs something, and I make time for it, right? Because my child is you know, my top priority, and so I'm going to make time for whatever the things I value are. And so what we see in a lot of the data, when you look at what I think of as like hard to reach populations, this can be anything from, you know, like communities like poor communities or communities where, you know, you have people that are materially less able to have a lot of free time, or people that are hard to reach because they're like ideologically disaffected in some way. So it could be like conservative environmentalists or you know, evangelicals committed to racial justice or something like that. What you see in a lot of those things is that the biggest predictors of how much time and effort people put into participation is not the kind of material free time they have, it's whether or not they have early experiences of their own agency, whether or not they feel like what they do matters, right? And so when people have an early experience that what they do makes a difference, then they're willing to put a lot more time into it. When they feel like they're kind of cogs in a machine, in a bigger machine, then people are really smart and they're like, well, if I don't show up, I'm just a warm body. Someone else's warm body is going to fill my seat, and so then it becomes interchangeable. And so I think the challenge is to think about how we balance those things against each other.
I see a question from the Zoom, which is, yeah, thanks.
Why does the sort of community building you address work to the advantage of your side of the political spectrum?
Yes.
Can you read that?
Yeah.
I can read it.
Yeah.
Could it just as easily help build the wall and birthright citizenship, take charge of the 7 mountains, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be really clear, like I'm not trying to claim that getting people involved is only one thing that is something that affects only one side of the political spectrum. I think there's actually a lot of data that shows that in the United States, there are ways in which certainly like Christian congregations on the right are much more effective at getting people involved in public life than Christian communities on the left. There's also a lot of data comparatively and historically around the world that often thick civil society institutions were carriers of authoritarianism, right? And so we know that civil society can be a carrier for democracy or a carrier for authoritarianism. One of the big questions that we're grappling with at the SNF Agora Institute is kind of this question of what are the conditions under which it's one or the other. And we can know that ex post, right? Like we can look back historically and say like, well, that was not so great. Like in Chile, it was like a carrier for the rise of Pinochet or something like that, right? Like we can know that ex post. The challenge is to know that ex ante, right? To sort of say, right now, before I know exactly how history is going to unfold in the coming 10 years, here's an organization that is more likely to lead people towards this authoritarian path versus a non-authoritarian path. And so I think, and so we have hypotheses around that about sort of what the nature of the kinds of organizations are that are likely to lead people towards democratic versus anti-democratic pathways. But it is absolutely true that I can support an ideological agenda that exists across the political spectrum. A couple caveats, not caveats, but a couple kind of like addenda that I will say to that. I firmly believe in my heart of hearts that we have a better society and we're better able to do the work of forging a common life together, which is ultimately what democracy is in my mind, if all people feel equipped to be authors of their own future. And that's true for people I agree with and people I disagree with, And like, I want to live in a world in which people across the political spectrum feel like they have the ability to exercise their voice in the political spectrum. And then I want to find it out with the people I disagree with, right? Then I want to be in a political arena in which we have rule of law and a set of institutions and processes that enable us to kind of debate this question of what is best for our society. I think the challenge that we have right now is so many people feel so disaffected from the political system that they don't have avenues but to sort of try to blow up the system itself. There's a African proverb that I'm going to butcher. It's beautiful if I could remember it, but it's something like, the child who feels rejected by his village will burn it up to feel its warmth. Which, and again, like I'm saying, it's much more beautiful if I were to say it eloquently, but you get the point, right? And so I think we're in a little bit of that moment right now.
I see 3 hands, 1, 2, 3, maybe all at once, and then, because we only have, not all at once.
I'm sorry, I feel like really
All
long.
in a row, maybe, so I'm sorry, because I think we've got 9 minutes left.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Just let's hear the questions, thank you.
You can choose
Which
question
order?
that's-
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I've got 2 things I'm thinking, but I'll ask one.
Your favorite.
Related to the supply side question you were saying, I think, just, can you say a little bit about how someone like me, who is, I basically never encounter the right in my feelings, and I'm a thoughtful political
Sure.
person, and is there a place for me to be bridging or putting myself out or welcoming people in? I haven't found that in my life.
Okay, one, Sally?
It's a Carroll County.
Sally, do you want to?
So at UMBC Shriver Center, we think a lot about how we break down some of these community university barriers, distrust of politics. There's real distrust of universities and their agendas. And I'm curious how you approach that.
Rabbi?
So my question is about, specifically, you studied a mega church. We only get 30,000 here. So those are the numbers, but I am curious if you learned it, we do think a lot about what it means to make claims about God, right? Like what do our scriptural traditions say? And I was really struck by the Anglican bishop who spoke at the service with Trump, and there was an interesting piece of the Times about these sort of competing views of Christianity. So I'm curious if you did you learn anything about how to lay kind of authentic claim to tradition in that way that might be useful for a congregation like this one that is less politically diverse, but certainly has diversity of ideas and perspectives within it, and that's something we really cherish here.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, all great questions. So on this question of how to find opportunity for bridging, so I think there's two different ways to think about that question. Like there's tactical things I could say, like about Carroll County, there's plenty of people who disagree with you, most likely. If you look at the data, then often we know that people's workplaces, I don't know your workplaces, but that often like workplaces are some of the few institutions in America where you still see politically diverse people coming together because they have, they're not selected in based on political ideologies or, so the question is sort of like, where are the places where you can find those places? But so there's tactical answers to the question. I think the kind of broader, a less tactical way to think about it is, how do we collectively as a society think about kind of, dismantling some of the sort of natural ideological divides that have begun to, permeate our lives? And I think I would say that, I would say two things. I think that like we all have things that we can do in our individual lives, which are these more like tactical things, that like often, when again, like, and this is not a comment on, I feel like I'm trying to make it delicate here because I don't actually know a lot about what your personal life is like, right? But often when I have this kind of conversation with a student, let's say, then when I probe their life, when I probe the kind of different places and the opportunities that they have, it turns out that they actually probably do have more opportunities than they think to encounter people who have different views from them. Maybe not voting Republican or voting, it may not be as extreme as whatever, but that like there's a natural inclination to avoid the hard conversations because it's impolite, And so part of the question is just like, how do we begin to sort of make it natural to sort of talk about the hard things with people that that may or may not sort of align perfectly with us, even within the political left. Like, how do we have conversations about race or things that that have like deep divides even within an ideologically homogenous place. The second thing is kind of this question of like, what is the responsibility that we all have to sort of think about the collective settings that make possible the kind of dismantling of those walls or not, And so we are all part of different kind of settings, workplaces, faith institutions, neighborhoods, geographic communities, online communities, whatever they are, and how do we begin to sort of reshape those or not, And I think it's a question. I think almost all of those have the opportunity to kind of like reshape the supply side. The question is how much effort people want to put in. So that's one thing. On the distrust of universities, huge issue. We think about this all the time at the Institute. What I'll say is that my read on the data about trust in institutions, trust in institutions, period, across the board are at historic lows in the United States. This is true of universities, it's true of all these different kind of things. I think the challenge that the challenge is that, to me, the best data and research on how you rebuild trust starts with the idea that trust is social, right? And so, if I'm trying to talk to someone, whether they're on the left or the right, who believes in some kind of disinformation, right? Like a hippie mom who doesn't want to vaccinate her children, to, someone who believes in January, that January 6th was not or whatever, that Trump won the election, right? The worst thing I can do is like send scientific papers, showing them that like vaccines work, right? The best thing I can do is have another hippie mom go and talk to this mother and say, you know, like I share a lot of your values, but like I'm going to vaccinate my children, and here's why, you know. And so trust is kind of trust in institutions, trust in each other is a social phenomenon. And so I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I do feel like, you know, the way we rebuild trust is to also rebuild the social fabric, you know, of the kind of civic institutions that we've been talking about. I think universities, you know, that have this kind of challenge of the community university relationship have to think seriously about what their relationship to the communities that they inhabit are, right? And what the kind of social ties are that enable a kind of, you know, social re-knitting of that social fabric and creating a kind of tapestry that makes the kind of conversations that are necessary possible. So, okay, on this question about kind of laying claim to tradition. So just to kind of give a little bit of background on that. So, you know, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and you know, Catholicism, for those of you who don't know, it's like there's a pope, there's cardinals, and I mean, there's a clear hierarchy about how doctrine is established, right? And I was like blown away when I like went into evangelicalism, and as far as I can tell, it's like the Wild West of Christianity out there, right? Because there's no kind of like central authority within Protestant evangelicalism that sort of says like, here's the things that we believe. And so there's actually this like very robust debate within Christian evangelicalism about what constitutes an evangelical, you know? And so, or the kind of Protestant evangelicals. Crossroads, the church that I studied the most closely, kind of comes out of this tradition where it's like, you know, they believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. They believe in the notion of salvation through Jesus, you know, they believe in this notion of being born again, and they believe in evangelism. So there are kind of like four tenets that hold together. But even when you say something like inerrancy of the Bible, there's like 35,000 verses in the Bible. So two people can read the same thing and have very different interpretations of what that means, you know? And that was part of what Undivided.
Yes.
Right, I was thinking. Okay, well, so that was part of what Undivided, the people who are agitating around Undivided really grappled with within the church, is because they read they are all people of faith. They read the Bible, and it was very clear that Jesus had a vision of a multiracial church in their mind, right? And then other people in their church read the Bible and said they're very clear that, you know, submission to authority is like the key tenet, you know, whatever. So there's different debates that kind of like went on within that. And so the technical answer to your question is that Crossroads, like a lot of Protestant evangelical megachurches, has what's called a spiritual board. The spiritual board is the ultimate kind of governing authority within the church, and that sort of says like, here's what we believe, here are the tenets that we sit by. That's a technical answer. The kind of real answer is there's this robust conversation that was constantly going on within Undivided, within Crossroads, and so on. But two kind of things that I'll say about that. I think part of what made that possible was, one, Crossroads had a motto that I've actually thought a lot about in relation to other political work that I do, which is the idea that belonging comes before belief, right? And so they were really clear that like, look, you know, we're a Protestant evangelical megachurch. We believe Jesus is the Savior, blah, 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 blah. Like, you don't have to believe what we believe in order to belong to us, right? So you can be Christian, you cannot be Christian, you can believe in no God, a different God, our God, whatever, right? You're still welcome. And if you showed up, if any, you know, to a Crossroads service, there's this kind of ethos of radical welcome that, you know, and there's free coffee, and it's good coffee. It's like everyone's really nice, and so it just makes it makes people feel really connected in a way. And I think that's the opposite of a lot of our political organizations, where implicitly we sort of have an ethos of belief coming before belonging, you know. And so, you know, when I was on book tour, I remember I did a book event in this like lefty community organizing group in, you know, on the East Coast, and you know, I showed up to this event, and someone was talking to me. It was really very, very kind. And then afterwards he's like, well, how did you get here? And I was like, oh, I just took the train here. And he's like, oh, you took the train here? Well, how did you offset your carbon? You know? And I was like, and of course I had not offset my carbon. I mean, maybe not of course, but like, okay, I took the MTA, fact I hadn't offset my carbon, right? But when he asked me that question, like it implicitly made me feel like, oh, like he's basically telling me like you're not good enough to be a part. Like it made me feel like you're not good enough, you're not pure enough to be a part of this group, you know? And so that's kind of but I think implicitly or explicitly we do that a lot. We sort of give, communicate this message that belief comes before belonging. And so Crossroads had a lot of these like theological debates, but they did it in this context of creating this like notion of what radical welcome. The second thing I did is that the structure of the churches, it's a 35,000 person church. On average, most mega churches have about 65% of their congregation organized in what's called small groups. And small groups are essentially self-governing, small d democratic spaces that are organized around everything from like a Bible study to help with your taxes to, people who want to get drinks on the West Side on Friday nights or something like that, And those small groups essentially create venues where people are in intimate relationship with a group of people in their church. They feel like they have a space where they can help design what's going on, so that allows a church to bend without breaking, so that when there is deep division and people disagreed with what the head pastor said, what held the church together was not what the head pastor did, but was in small groups, and so that enabled this kind of debate to happen. So.
Thank you.
Yes.